So, I was just asking you about the experience of us both at Marymount School. And I was saying I had quite a positive experience, but Annette had a difficult one. And then she got moved across to the new campus at Bougival.
Yeah.
And Jane started school as a very young 4-year-old, I think, in 1969.
Yes, I didn't want her to go to school at that age, but she was adamant that she didn't want to be left behind.
So she went to Bougival as well, didn't she? The two of them.
They did have a kindergarten there.
And that was quite a lovely place, wasn't it? It was a big kind of old home set in beautiful gardens.
An old homestead.
The Bougival suburb is famous because it was one of the retreats for the Impressionist painters. They used to love. There's some famous paintings done in that period by people like Renoir and.
Well, if you look at Vaucresson, La Selle Saint-Cloud, all that area, it was a really rich part of Paris, where all the big homes were.
The wealthiest part of Paris, for sure. Apart from the absolutely top arrondissements. But Bougival's built on a kind of a curve of the Seine, so it's surrounded by the river on 2 or 3 sides. And the land out there is beautiful, but also extremely expensive.
Yeah.
Anyway, the nuns had a gift, I think, or it was a land that was a legacy from a...
I'm not quite sure how they got that, but they certainly did have this big property, which, as you say, was obviously someone's home, and they converted some of those bedrooms, they would have been into classes. And they brought some of the school, but not all of the school, from Neuilly to Vaucresson, and you happened to be in that transfer.
Well, I was not. I stayed at Neuilly.
No, you stayed. Annette went, and so did Jane.
Annette and Jane went to Bougival, and I stayed at Neuilly. But so I remember that as quite a good time, and I made good friends there. And I've, you remember, of course, my friend David Moray, who was with the Malaysian embassy, and it was a very international school. All the kids there, although American English was the lingua franca, and we all picked up American accents, the actual classes were full of kids from all around the world. I remember kids from Nigeria.
I remember when you came home and went to school here, they used to call you the Yank.
Yes, well, I had an American accent, a Midwestern American accent, yes. So, but there's lots to talk about that time in France. There was the political unrest associated with the decline of de Gaulle and the famous referendum in early 1968, which ultimately resulted in him resigning and leaving government. And then
he was in London when we were there, wasn't he?
During the Second World War.
No, but when we first went to Paris, wasn't?
No, he was in Paris.
I thought he was in London for some of that time.
No, not at all. No, he was in.
None of it.
He was the president of France.
I know.
So he was not in London. He was in France the whole time we were there.
I don't know why.
There was a very contentious referendum in the early part of 1968, which he lost, and which he felt was his death knell in politics, and he ended up resigning. And the Pompidou,
I remember that.
His chosen successor became the president, and it led to a great deal of unrest. And there were the famous May 1968 riots in Paris, which resulted in huge strikes and great disruption, and one of the most famous times of the 1960s in France.
I can remember your father and I sitting in a cafe in Paris, out on the sidewalk as you did, when we could hear the marching of, was it the students? It was the students at that time.
And left-wing radicals.
And we could hear them marching down from the Arc de Triomphe, coming down that way, down to where we were. And the next thing I knew, the owner of the cafe had pulled up our table, pulled us up and dragged us into the restaurant, slammed shut the doors until they all went by.
Yeah, well, it was pretty wild times. The Dad used to catch the train in from Vauclaucin into Saint-Lazare, the famous railway station,
Yeah.
which figured in quite a few impressionist paintings.
Where did I get Gardiner from?
Well, I don't know, but Saint-Lazare was the station.
Yeah, it was. It was.
And just nearby was his office in Rue de la Pépinière.
Yeah, he just walked down the
A
road.
short distance from Gath Saint-Lazare. So it was possibly around that area where you were when you heard these.
Yeah, it was a cafe that was pretty well underneath his office.
Right. But the May riots in 1968 were very, very severe. There was a big battle between the left and the old right, particularly, the Second World War kind of stalwarts, people like de Gaulle and so forth, who were forced to more or less give up power, and then there was big change in France. And in fact, it's interesting, 20 and 30 years later, they called them the 68ards. Do you understand what that means?
No.
The 68ers.
All right.
The 68ards were the famous kind of political group that then became the governing powers in France in the 70s and 80s, 80s and 90s really, who had all cut their teeth in politics as rioters in 1968. And how that group became very powerful in French politics.
And a lot of those students would have moved on too, I suppose.
That's what I'm saying. The students grew up and became
leaders.
Fully fledged politicians. And many of those look back on that time as being one of their most important.
I'll never forget, it was really scary, hearing them shouting, and you could actually hear their marching, on the road. You could hear quite strong, and it was coming closer and closer.
I have memories of going near some of the streets where they pulled up the cobblestones and were throwing
they threw them.
Throw them at the police.
And cars or anything.
And you could still smell some of the bits of the tear gas that had been used to try and break up the crowds.
Shaun, I have to stop here because I've got somebody that's going to be waiting downstairs.
Right, let's stop.